Put on your
I
best.
have to sit up straight.
Yeah. So tonight in our series, we are talking about church freedom, which Alice did a great job of kind of describing in her sermon on Sunday. And by now in the series, you might be thinking to yourself, some of these freedoms seem to kind of overlap. Like they seem to have some characteristics that are common. And I think that's the case. There is a man named Walter Sheridan who Mary a couple of weeks ago quoted in her midweek gathering as describing these 4 Baptist freedoms as the fragile freedoms. And they're really, religious freedom, church freedom, Bible freedom, soul freedom. They're all of them have tenets that interconnect and speak to one another. So if you hear some things that are repetitive or sound similar, it's because they are. It's sort of, and they all go back to this core belief of the priesthood of believers and this idea of freedom. So tonight, I want us to discuss a few things around church freedom. And I have a handout I created that I'll be posting in the e-news when we send out this video. The 2 sources for that are this book that I just talked about, and another book called Down by the Riverside by a guy named Everett Goodwin. And he's a Baptist scholar. And I actually went to divinity school with his daughter. She and I were one of the 2 Baptists at Harvard Divinity at the time when I was there. So I actually stayed at his house once. We were friends and went to New York. And so I got to meet him. But he's written a great book and it's in our church library if you want to learn more. So, but first, just to get us started, in your own words, how would you describe church freedom? Or what are some of the characteristics of church freedom? And it's okay if you quote Pastor Alice from Sunday. It's like a pop.
Independence.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, one
That's
word.
what I was going to say, free to interpret, yeah.
You can't come up with a better word than that, because all the things that we do, we can do independently, whether it's decision making, policy making, how we invite people. It all boils down to that.
Yeah. And who is independent in church freedom? Like when you say independence, who has that independence?
Oh, the individual congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really key, is that it's the both and. Yeah. What are some of the things that, what does church freedom impact on a kind of a practical day-to-day level? How do you see it playing out, like at Calvary or the local church?
Well, it can be harder to not have someone telling you what to do and what to believe and how to act on Sunday morning and who to serve communion to and who's going to be your lead pastor or senior minister, whatever you call them, because you have to decide all this stuff for yourself. And sometimes I think that leads to conflict in the congregation because everybody has a different opinion about what's right and what we should do and what we shouldn't, or how we should do it. And I'm sure that's true in other congregations too that are not as independent, but at least they don't have to, I can just say, well, somebody else decided that.
Yeah.
I think it also gives you the freedom to question and not feel guilty about the questioning. I've been seeing on Facebook from this one person that, and it's quoting, and it's basically saying about our sins, and Jesus was born Jesus died to forgive us of our sins, and because of that, we're saved and all of this. And so my question every time I see it is if we're saved, what about those people that don't believe in Jesus, and that kind of thing. So it's just having that freedom to be able to do that.
Yeah. And that's kind of even what you're saying, Becky, is kind of tying back to religious freedom as well. So
Yeah.
it's and scriptural freedom, and yeah, they're all kind of connected. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the ways, well, actually 3 of you on the screen. I mean, one of the ways we see this live out on a monthly basis at Calvary is through council meetings. I mean, when our council gathers to discuss and discern and vote and hear the report about the building from Bill and all of that, we're taking part in church freedom, right? And the freedom of Calvary to elect those people to council, to have different voices, different professions. I think that's one of the big gifts as laity, lay members of the church, is like, you have the accountants and the construction workers and the, lawyers, teachers, social, whatever, serving and offering their gifts, because Lord knows they don't teach us all that in seminary. So we need you to help us know how to do those things. So those are some of the practical things. And, a general kind of traditional definition of church freedom from Walter Sheridan, who's kind of one of the scholars on this, is that basically it just means that local churches are free, and this is a key phrase, under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Now, that gets you back to freedom of interpretation. What does it mean under the lordship of Jesus Christ? So in other words, what he's trying to do is give a caveat or a clause to say, this is not just freedom like, woohoo, whatever goes, like we can run rampant and go rogue and all this kind of stuff. But, freedom for a local church under the lordship of Christ to determine their membership. That's not something we talk about a lot, but we can determine who we classify as a member and not. Each local church can. And our leadership, which you all mentioned, like who we call and elect as pastors. And then to order their work and their worship. So how we even do worship and what's included in our service. To ordain whoever they perceive as gifted for ministry. And here comes somebody else, Nancy Hoffmeister. And to participate in the larger body of Christ. And connect with others on mission. So we have freedom to connect with others as we wish. So hi, Nancy. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm late.
You're fine. We just started. We were just kind of throwing out what church freedom means. We're a small group tonight, so it's all good. So those are some of the characteristics of church freedom. And just to contextualize this historical movement for you, we've talked about this in this series, but we are part of what's called the Free Church tradition. And we are not the only ones. Baptists are part of that group. But again, just to remind you all, we are the dissenters from the established church back in England, 16th, 17th century, so we were formed from dissenting, and you could say that we're still dissenting today, and having the freedom of the local church, as you said, Carl, it kind of lends us to that disposition, but it all goes back to freedom. So the free church tradition at large, beyond even Baptist, essentially just affirms the freedom and the responsibility of the individual as being central in all matters of faith. But Sheridan qualifies it and says that doesn't mean lone rangerism. So while the individual is central, the individual is always an individual in community. And I thought that we've got another person joining us here. Hi, Joseph. It's good to have you on the call. So we're just talking about church freedom. And so it's not just an individual, it's individual and community. And Sheridan did a great job of tying it to the Bible. And he said, think about the biblical heroes we think about, and he listed, of course, only men, but Abraham, Moses, David, Jeremiah, Peter, and Paul, they're not portrayed in the Bible as invincible individualists, he says. who just in their isolation and their own work kind of whipped the forces of evil. It's the language he used. But he said, rather, they're portrayed as people in community. So whether you're talking about Israel in the Old Testament or the church, the early church in the New Testament, these are people who worked together, who relied on their historical identity, and they treasured and valued relationship. So all that said, Sheridan has these 4 things that says church freedom speaks to these 4 categories. Free to follow voluntarily. And what he means by follow is following Jesus. Free to govern obediently. Free to worship creatively, and free to minister responsibly. So the follow voluntarily is quite simple. It's just, we have the freedom to follow Jesus. But he adds a caveat saying we also have the freedom to help one another in following Jesus. So again, it's that accountability, that community. The second one, free to govern obediently, I want to kind of dive a little bit more into. So because we get to choose how we govern and how we structure ourselves, he says, and I thought this was really funny, idealistically, Baptists want the local church to be a Christocracy or Christocracy. In other words, we should all be obedient to the will and mind of Christ, right? If you think of, that could be a negative term, but if we should all be following Christ, perfectly, and we would be a Christocracy, as he said. But he said, he's waiting for new camera and microphone. But he said, to say it another way, even though that's what we should be ideally, practically, he says, we're more of a democracy, right? Because we're not perfect Christians, and we don't follow Jesus. So practically we function like a democracy. And I'm going to play a little game with us tonight. So there are 3 kinds of church government, essentially, that he lays out. And honestly, he says you can find biblical rationale for all 3 of these kinds of government, or way of governing, I should say, not government. So Episcopal, and when I say these words, it's little, not capital Episcopal, but little e Episcopal. The Episcopal way of church governing is authority placed in the hands of one person, usually a bishop, okay? Presbyterian, little p, is authority vested in a small group, often called elders, within the local church. Okay, so the elders, they make all the decisions. And you might get that confused and say, well, doesn't Calvary have a council that makes decisions? But the council is elected by the congregation and is making decisions on behalf of the congregation. And in truth, all major decisions have to be voted on by the entire congregation per our bylaws. Think of our ballot, our budget, who we call as a pastor. Whereas in the Presbyterian model, the elders would just make that decision. They would just pass the budget. And if you're not an elder, you're not contributing to that conversation, if that makes sense. Yeah, Carl.
How are the elders chosen in that model?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the elders are, in most, if we're talking about like most Presbyterian churches I know, there's a process that they go through with their church and their pastor. It's almost equivalent, I think, to like a deacon ordination, in the Baptist. We don't have deacons at Calvary, which is something I'm curious about always. But it's not, to my knowledge, in some churches, it might be a church-wide vote. In other churches, it might be like the minister, you meet these qualifications and the minister asks you to be an elder, but it's not specified how those, at least in this book, he doesn't go into detail. I mean, I'm sure I could have researched how it all works for them.
It's okay. I'm curious.
But yeah, I am too. I mean,
It sounds like they have some freedom.
Yes, yeah, they definitely have some freedom. It's not a key difference between the Episcopal and the Presbyterian is that the Episcopal authority level is coming really from outside of you, right? It's a bishop who's not part of your church telling you what to do. Whereas the Presbyterian, the elders, they're at least part of your church, right? They're part of the local. And then the third level, or the third group, is the congregational. And that is what Baptists are. And we have the authority placed in the hands of all members of the church, technically, right? You all have a voice. If you're a member, you can vote. So I was going to do this in small group discussion, but we're just going to do it all together. Do you remember like your old high school debate team? No, you were not. I wasn't on debate team either. But I want you to pretend, we're going to go through these categories, and I want you to pretend like you're pro-Episcopal model right now, okay? You are for the model where the authority is placed in the hands of one person or a bishop. Why would you argue that that's a good way of governing? What would be the pros, if you will?
Better educated.
Good. Yep.
Somebody that's trained to be in a leadership role, and we don't have to spend all this time making decisions. Somebody who's quite capable and learned should be for us.
And there are too many people involved in decision making that don't know why or what they're making the decision about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so just let one person who has studied it, knows what they're doing, make that decision.
Yep.
It's
Better
easier
informed.
political. It may not enable so many divisions within the congregation if everybody has agreed to follow the leader.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody doesn't, you kick them out.
Yeah.
Any other pros?
Oh, sorry.
What about cons?
You don't always have the say of the people. I mean, if it's just one person,
Mm-hmm.
kind of dictatorship in a way.
Yeah.
And that person also can start feeling very powerful with all that power and start making decisions that he's not concerned what people think or what the church want, just what's good for him.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think
Think?
then,
That happens?
I think
Well,
that if that happens, like was Christine was saying, then your congregation starts feeling, well, I don't amount to nothing. I don't matter. I just gotta go with whatever they're telling me.
Like sheep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or leave.
Yeah.
Or what?
Leave.
Oh.
Well, and I also think, and to no fault of a bishop or no fault of that person, I think it's hard to be in touch with what's happening on the ground with so many different churches under your watch. I mean, you can only be so many places and understand so many situations. So I think one disadvantage of that system is that you may not even realize that something that you think that you're advising is for the good of the whole. You may not realize that in one little county in your district, that's actually not going to fly because of, who knows, maybe there was like because of the industry that's there, or there was a big flood there, there's something that you don't know fully, and you're making a decision on behalf of that only the people on the ground level would know. And I think there could be some communication because some of these bishops have huge districts. Some are very small, but some of them cover a lot of ground.
And the vocal get the ear, and those who are not so vocal, not being vocal is not the same thing as being content. And but some groups and some people are more prone to register their discontent.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the feedback you're getting, and you're not talking to a lot of other groups that are under constraint,
Right.
Pretty distorted understanding of what you think people are really thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Do the bishops get it from the various areas? Do they get together and agree?
I don't know about
on
agree.
policy?
But they do get together. I mean, I think they, like I know in the Episcopal Church, yeah, the bishop, they all have meetings, and it's funny because in all of these systems, they all have, like you could say our bishop, if you will, is Stephen Ostrin, like our executive minister. We all have these things. It's just it's about the power that we give them. right? And so we all, there's different levels of, Steve's job is to convene churches and to convene pastors together. Bishops, whoever's higher than a bishop in the Episcopal Church, they don't call it a cardinal or a pope, that's Catholic, call it something. But that person is in charge of getting all the bishops together. So there's all these layers to it that kind of work their way up.
So the bishop doesn't have ultimate power to make
No,
decisions.
they have to listen to their superior. It just keeps funneling, similar to the Catholic Church, how it all funnels to the Pope. And
Mhm.
supposedly the Pope is funneling to Jesus. So it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's like it's all funneling to one person. So let's switch gears and let's pretend we're in the Presbyterian system. Okay. So the authority has been vested in a small group of people. And let's just call that small group of people you all. You are the elders for a church, for your local church. What are the pros of the way you govern?
We're
You get to
closer
decide
to
the
the
budget.
people.
You are?
Close, we can represent even informally friends and people we know.
I would say it's more efficient.
Yes.
You don't have to ask the whole group every time you want to make a decision.
Right, small, yeah.
Be faster.
You don't have
faster
to wait till
decisions. Yeah.
January to change the budget. You can get things done quicker.
Right.
Smaller group versus larger group.
Or lightweight,
What's it?
more lightweight than having to consult with large groups of people like full congregations
Yeah.
or active congregations and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, from a pastor's perspective, one pro I would see is that because they don't change, they don't rotate, once you're an elder, always an elder, you're not constantly getting to know new people or orienting people to a discussion that you had a couple of years ago that's resurfaced. You don't have to get, like, more people are more likely to kind of be on board, now I can see a con to that as well.
I was just going to say, that sounds like a con.
Exactly. So the con, I think, would be, I mean, the pro is deepened relationships and, what do you call it? What do they call, I use this word all the time, historical memory or
Collective memory?
collective memory, like in like
Tradition.
Yeah, like you have that, like, you have like your Mary Holst that's always just with you, who knows everything. So you have that kind of knowledge. Institutional memory is, I guess, is what I'm thinking of.
All right.
Yeah. But the con of that is that, it's harder to get new voices, new perspectives in. It can become the clergy's, like, good old boys or good old girls club, it's all their friends, and you can get a myopic view. I think that could be a con potentially.
An individual who's dysfunctional or a group or portion of your presbytery that's dysfunctional, you're stuck with them for a long time.
Mhm. Right. There's no, like, rotating off in a couple of years.
Right.
Reminds me of a lot
That's
of
our
things that
son,
Philip Gully writes about the groups that have led his church. And it's really fun to read, but at the same time, he makes this point that these people can assume more power, influence than is easy to work with.
Yeah. Any other pros or cons y'all can think of?
Well, if they do last or in their position a long time, no new ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they could, I guess, feasibly get new ideas or talk to people, but that's assuming taking a lot of responsibility on them, because we as humans typically are pretty set in our ways. Like, it's hard for us to think outside of the box, it's just how we are. It is what it is,
One of the gifts of old age is that we already know everything. So, but truthfully, the older you get, the more you realize what you don't know.
You don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah, to slip into that node of, this person's telling me this and I don't agree with them and we're just not going to go there. And, you got to wait till I'm dead to do anything about it.
Carl, I had muted you temporarily because of the phone call. So if you want to talk, you can unmute yourself. Did you hear me, Carl? There you go.
I hear you,
Okay.
but I'm on the phone with my son.
Oh,
So-
okay, okay.
So we're muting ourselves.
Perfect, perfect.
and We're
Okay,
in church. That's okay.
so final one is our congregational. You know about this because how Calvary is structured. Pros, what are the pros? Why does this work? Well, why should we organize this way?
Everyone has a part in making a decision. And you may not end up in the majority, but at least you had a vote
And a voice.
Mhm.
and a voice. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one pro is that it gives a lot of people an opportunity to develop into leaders who may not have thought of themselves as a leader, or may not have thought to consider a leadership position and to kind of try on like leaders. If you think about the way council works or a congregational meeting works, if someone, they may think they don't have a voice or don't, but maybe one meeting they get up and they say something and you realize, oh, people listen to them. Or if you think about someone being elected under a council, maybe they weren't sure, but they can try it out for 2 years and see if, that it's a kind of leadership that speaks to them. I don't know. I always think of it as like cultivating. It's a different kind of voice and leadership in the church that is harder, I think, to cultivate when you have to have all these qualifications, whether you're talking about deacons or elders, to even become a deacon or elder. Does that make sense? Like we have certain things you have to do to be on our council, but it's not super high standards, for better or worse. Like it's not, there are a few things, but I mean, we really try to say, okay, let's try to get a different voice that we don't have on, or let's try to get, and I think that can be a pro.
Are decisions better accepted by the whole group when the whole group has had a chance to vote? So you can proceed and implement maybe a little bit with a little more certainty.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, when done well, congregational governance brings everyone on board, or at least, as Christine said, if it goes in a direction that you didn't vote for, you've at least heard the voices of those who did vote for it and why. And there's an understanding that it's not just one person's kind of agenda. So I do think idealistically it works well. Now I will say it is very hard to do congregational governance well, I think, and intentionally, and to know the pace at which to do it, how fast, how slow, when do you wait to bring people along, when do you move forward? And I think that's a dance that in my own clergy groups, we talk a lot about. On the one hand, we're hired to lead, we're called to lead a church. On the other hand, we're not the boss. The congregation is our boss, the council leadership. And so there are times where you're really spinning your wheels. Some people want you just to make a decision and be the senior pastor and lead. And other people are saying, this is not your call, it's the church. So I think a lot of us wrestle with that balance, but I think that's a healthy tension to wrestle with. I think it's kind of like the checks and balances in our government. It's like when they work well, that's how they're supposed to be working, is like a check and balance, but it's not always easy to know. Yeah. Okay. Any cons with that?
One con that comes to my mind is in a federation of churches, such as we exist at the regional level. There is a discontinuity of policy and perspective and some of those broad categories that can lead to some conflict. I do think that we tend to think of like the ABCRM is a, no, I just said a word, doggone it. Sorry, this happens more often. But, a denomination, gosh. It just gets-
Yeah.
But it's really not, but especially from the outside, people tend to look at a group, some kind of regional level of governance, even if it's just suggestive, is seen as a denomination. And us congregationally led groups understand the difference, but a lot of outsiders don't.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and you lead to what I was going to talk about next, Bill, which is really important, is that Sheridan in his book points out that congregationalism never meant isolationism. And he said within less than 50 years of the formation of the First Baptist Church in the 17th century, Baptist churches voluntarily began grouping themselves into associations. So this goes way back in our history. And, he said we did it for theological reasons to show our, quote, oneness in Christ, but also for practical reasons. And most Baptists are known, their associations developed because we realized we don't have enough money to sponsor a missionary on our own. We don't have enough to do effective mission work. And so if we get a few churches together and each give a little bit of money, we can send a missionary somewhere. So even back in our early days, Baptists of all flavors, American Baptist, Southern Baptist, Progressive, National, we came together around a desire to be the Church of Christ, if you will, out in the world in a way that we can't do on our own. Now, there's all different philosophies of missions and through the years what that looks like. But Baptists recognized early on that it's great to be our own independent local church, but we can't do everything on our own. And that has developed in our more modern days to ecumenical groups. I mean, think of something like Family Promise. One church can't necessarily host all these families in their building all year long, but we can work together with other congregations and temples to be a program like Family Promise. So whether you're talking about mission work, advocacy, local ways we meet needs locally in our city, Baptist churches have the freedom to associate with others to accomplish what we can't do on our own. So that's a big point that Sheridan makes. And he says, if someone ever says the Baptist church, that's incorrect. Because while there is like the Methodist church, the Episcopal church, really, and you'll notice this, we're the American Baptist churches of the Rocky Mountains. We're the American Baptist Churches USA. So that should always be plural. And if you ever hear someone says, well, the Baptist church believes, that's not really, there is not one Baptist church voice. And that's a really important point in thinking about church freedom. And honestly, it goes down even more to say, if you ever hear someone say, well, everyone at Calvary believes, well, we have individual soul freedom in our beliefs. So while Calvary has some beliefs and statements that we might make, we cannot say with certainty that every single person at Calvary thinks the same way, believes the same way, and we all know that because we're here. But I think that some churches will say like, well, what is your creed? What is your belief? Or, and Baptists are just different. It's we're a little bit messier, I guess, with that. Okay. And then the last two areas, I know we're wrapping up toward our time, the last 10 minutes or so, but Sheridan really emphasizes how Baptists have a creativity to their worship. Sometimes Baptists are called anti-liturgical, but he points out that the word liturgy literally means the work of the people. That's what liturgy means, the work of the people. So in that way, he says that Baptists are actually some of the most liturgical people because Baptist churches tend to involve a lot of congregation members in our worship. Or if we don't, we really hypothetically, like ideally in the Baptist church structure, we should be. In other words, you should never just see a pastor or, up there on a Sunday without congregation member voices. And, I've been to some Baptist churches where all you hear is the Baptist, the preacher and the music minister. And some of that is church size. If you're a small church, you don't have as many people. But usually a Baptist church will at least have one, like a layperson, read the scripture. Have any of you ever been a part of a Baptist church where it wasn't, like where there wasn't any lay leadership, or has there always been an element of, whether it's a choir or a soloist or someone who's not paid leading in some way? You probably can't think of it, because I think Baptists do a pretty good job of somehow involving a layperson, and Sheridan says that's a big distinction. You might see a lay reader like in an Episcopal church, but even that, those are like trained people who are trained to be the liturgists, and they go through rotations. So, and he says Baptists have the freedom to take from different traditions as much or little structure as they want. The pros of that is that you can create a culture of worship that meets your congregation's needs. The cons of that might be that you have people who like different styles of worship and are never really sure what they're getting or what a church is going to be like. And, certainly from city to city, place to place, you can walk into a Baptist church and have no idea what to expect, worship wise or theology wise for that matter. And that's hard. Becky's experiencing that. You moved, right, to a new place. Christine moved to a new place. I don't know how much church shopping you've done, but it's hard to not just walk into another Baptist church and know exactly what it's going to be like, right?
No, and the Baptist church here, matter of fact, isn't doing very well. So I'm going to have to probably look at other churches. But so I've gone to a Presbyterian. So when you said the elders and everything, I'm looking it up and doing all of this stuff. But as a whole, I kind of like the church, but I've decided to wait till fall to really get into it and just kind of keep streaming with Calvary and stuff.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people go to churches for very practical reasons. What's the church they like? The community, the preacher.
The community, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, Bill and I have, when we were trying to find a church closer when we first got married, because my home church was so far away to drive all the time, we went to various ones. And I'm telling you, they flew the flag of being Baptist, but they were one was very charismatic and everybody was, all that kind of stuff. And others were very quiet. And others we went to, I don't know what was going on, but the preacher was pretty mad at the whole congregation from something that happened at Vacation Bible School. And it was like, get us out of here.
It was actually quite interesting. That was in Colorado.
Yeah, that was here.
That was in Aurora. But we went to a church one Sunday morning, and the pastor asked the ushers to lock the door, and then he started in on this thing, letting that congregation have it. And he said nobody can leave. Well, we got up and left anyway.
We left. We said, no,
Yeah.
we don't know what's going on here. And I mean, I'm sorry, but we never went back at all.
I don't think that's the right forum to deal with that.
Nope.
No.
Because if something went wrong at their VBS,
Right.
it wasn't every member of the congregation that
No.
instigated it or was the problem. There was a few select people.
Yeah.
And
No.
sometimes it takes a lot less courage to deal with a whole group like that and be nameless than to actually deal with the people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And that has to do with we all need proper training and how to handle conflict and so many people are ill-equipped and not trained properly in those things.
I think that was SBC, but I can't remember. That's 40 years ago. So
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads to the last little topic in the last 5 minutes is this question of ordination, that we're free to ordain. Now, the key with Baptists is Baptists don't have to have ordained ministers. In fact, traditionally, we would say priesthood of believers, well, we're all priests. We can all, minister to one another. And that means there's different standards, like an independent Baptist church can just call someone to be their pastor, whether they've been to seminary or not. whether they've had any outside body approve them or not. We see an unfortunate case of this in Fred Phelps in Kansas and his church, which his website, I don't even want to repeat, but he's the church that protests military deaths, gay people, all kinds of stuff. I mean, and that church, Westboro Baptist Church, bears the Baptist name. But his church is essentially his family members, right? That's all his descendants. But Goodwin, in his book, he talks about ordination being one of the things that Baptists have kind of, many Baptists, he says, have moderated some of their original views and principles about, and that we've kind of adopted a more mainline acceptance of ordination, meaning we have educational standards and requirements. Many Baptists, whether you're Progressive Baptist or American Baptist or Cooperative Baptist, they want their pastors to have an MDiv degree from an accredited seminary. You go through an ordination process that's recognized by a region. All these things that probably back in the day, our Baptist forefathers would be like, what? But in general, we've kind of adapted a little bit on that. And it's not that when someone's ordained, they have more power or prestige or authority, but he says ordination is really about symbolizing the confidence that the congregation sees in that person for their gifts for ministry, but also the responsibility they're giving that person. It's a big responsibility to have this label, this title, to have people in your spiritual care, if you will. And it matters, right? It's not something to be taken lightly. There's ethics with it. There's, things that you need to know how to do, like handle conflict appropriately, like Bill and Robin were just talking about. So anyway, we've kind of adapted with ordination, and that's something that, quite honestly, our church is wrestling with. As a local church, we can ordain anyone that we feel is gifted and called, but we have a regional level that has a different belief than us on who we can ordain. And it's difficult. It's where it feels like, well, something is not quite Baptist about this. Something is not quite matching. And so it's one of the points of, I don't know if tension is the right word, but it's one of our, because we've kind of adapted this ordination system a little bit, we feel that tension, I guess is one way to say it. So it's not easy, but any thoughts on ordination? Or, do you want your ministers to be ordained and educated? Or
Sure.
Yes.
or should I just call on Carl to preach next week? Brother Carl, it's your turn.
That's different. That would be a guest. We've had guests.
Yes, we have. Yep.
Although I'm trying to think of one that wasn't ordained.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of guests, but most of them, I think, have been ordained ministers. I'd be happy to, but it would only last 5 minutes and then it's for everything.
Fine. That's fine. People would love that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, people can be highly educated without being ordained. So
Yeah.
what is the education piece of the ordination that the Baptists feel is so important?
Well, if you're not an educated, I mean specifically having gone to an accredited seminary where you're learning, something of Bible history, context, Greek, Hebrew, where you're learning theology, you're learning some stuff about the history of the church, all of that. So many would say that education is important to have some sound theological basis, or to know what you're talking about when you read the Bible. To some extent, I'm just as confused by the Bible as you all are, but I have more tools at my disposal to create even more confusion for me. Because I can read it, I can study in its original language, I can learn about the context, and then it's all the job of the pastor is to kind of translate some of that knowledge, to the congregation to empower you all in your learning and your theological growth. And so you don't have to have education to be a good, effective preacher, pastor, leader, but I think that's why they value it.
Well, I was trying to figure out you asked about how we felt about the ordination
Oh, okay.
and the importance of that. Education, yes, sound background, yes. So what is the ordination piece that Baptists feel is so important, that
What's the
process?
secret sauce? The secret sauce. Yeah, no. This is my personal opinion, is that ordination is important as I'll use the kind of the term as a blessing for the person being ordained, to know that their gifts have been seen and recognized by a congregation as being effective, helpful, good. In other words, a call to ministry is not just, oh, I think I'm a good preacher and I think I want to lead a church. God's calling me. It means that somebody else beyond myself has to also feel that I have gifts for ministry, that I'm at least a decent, effective pastoral listener, a decent preacher, have a good heart, good ethics, if you will, have been screened in some way for intentions. It's kind of that there's ethics to it, but there's also just sometimes there are things that are hard to put your finger on. But some people are really educated but can't communicate well, so
Sensitivity, perspective.
yeah.
Some of the ones you just named there were really good. Ethics.
Mhm.
We've certainly seen that play out a few times here and there.
Mhm. So, I mean, I think for me, as one who has been ordained, it was important for me because I'm always doubting my call. And I always feel like, who am I to be saying anything to people? But like, I remember my ordination as, no, these people, like, they see gifts for me, for me. And I think for a congregation, it allows you to say, oh no, this person's effective. And if you're ordained in one church, it's kind of like a code between churches that if I've served Calvary and I go to serve another church, it's like, well, she was ordained there and she served there for how many years has it been? 13 years. So she must be okay because they didn't kick her out. So it's kind of like, it's just a system like in any other profession, of I think a different level of accountability. But I
Both the region though and the local church have to accept. So it's taking away some of the authority of the local church because can't the region negate it?
So this is a little bit technical. We're going to be talking about this as a church soon, actually, but local churches ordain. So Calvary can ordain whoever we wish, and we do. We ordain who we feel. We have little ordination councils on our level. Regional recognition is important for your ordination to mean something on a practical, hireable level. So if I'm a pastor and I'm ordained by Calvary, that's great that y'all have blessed me. But if I'm not recognized by the region, when I leave Calvary, it's going to be very hard for me to get a job. I mean, it's possible they'll call all you and say, is Ann good? And, then I'll go to another region and then I'll have to go through their ordination process to try to get approved. If you're a chaplain, you have to have an accredited, you have to have that regional national level. If you're a military chaplain, you have to have that regional accredited, what most mainline denominations have, and I think that's partly Baptists have adapted too, because like on those, when you're talking about hospital chaplaincy, military chaplaincy, those university chaplaincy, they require that kind of accreditation. But truthfully, it is Calvary who ordains. And then it is the region who recognizes that ordination. And it's the recognition of the ordination that allows you to be hired and have opportunities. So there is a differentiation. And I would say it's an important one because it's nice if you're ordained, but if you can't get hired or get a job, then, that's tough. But technically the region cannot stop us from ordaining who we want and all of that. And personally, I come from a Baptist tradition, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, that did not require a regional recognition. So I was ordained by Wilshire Baptist Church, and my ordination committee at Wilshire and Dallas included some people from, like, it included somebody from an ecumenical, like someone who wasn't a Baptist pastor, and an interfaith person as well as people from the church. So they kind of created that system. But once I was ordained by Wilshire, I could go to any cooperative Baptist fellowship church, and they probably would have accepted that ordination because it's kind of like the system that those churches are used to. When I came to Calvary, Calvary asked me to get my ordination recognized by the region because I was not American Baptist. So I think from Calvary's perspective, you know, it's an American Baptist church. We want our pastors to have that American Baptist flavor, make sure they're in line with our, you know, who we are. And so I went through that process. It was essentially a second ordination process. But so Baptist, all that to say, Baptist associations have different views about this, you know, so. And if you have more questions, we're going to be talking about this a lot in the coming weeks, ordination and how the local church kind of plays out, because this was our fourth freedom tonight. And now for the next, I think we have 5 weeks left in the series. For the next 5 weeks, we're going to be talking about what does this look like and mean for us here at Calvary? What does it mean specifically to be American Baptist? What does it mean to be part of a region? What does it mean to ordain? Like all those kind of things we're kind of going to be diving deeper into. So we'll be exploring it some more. Any last thoughts before we head out?
Well, we're glad you passed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my, yes.
Hey, but you know,
Very glad.
I would never have even had the chance to pass if Calvary hadn't called me and hired me and voted on me. And, you know, a great example of church freedom, I will say, is when Calvary called Brian to be the senior pastor. You know, Brian Henderson and I were in the same, we were essentially candidates against one another.
Yeah.
And you all called Brian and I got the phone call. I was heartbroken. I didn't get it. And then 3 days later, I got a call saying, well, we have a minister who's moving across the country. We have a new opening. And you all, and I don't know how this transpired, but that search committee decided, you know, maybe we should call 2 pastors instead of 1. And I don't know how they got approval from you all or what that looked like. Or I don't know if it was crazy that they were presenting 2 candidates all of a sudden. But, you know, that's a great example of local church being able to make a decision like that. Think about if that had been a bishop that you had to go through to say, well, we kind of like this other person too. It just wouldn't have happened. You know, it would have been a very different process. So. And here we are today, 13 years later on Zoom. So, blessings to you all. Grateful to see you. And we'll be back next week.
Okay.
Hey.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye.
This
Thank
was
you.
wonderful.
Yeah, bye.
See ya.